Okay, great. So we have the recording in progress. And hello, everyone. This is David again with the next episode of our podcast. Today we have a great guest with us, and we have Greg Potter on the line. And he and ourselves will be discussing a very important topic, something that a lot of people are neglecting, but it's something that can make the difference when it comes to training and nutrition. And not only that, but general life and our behavior and how we feel. And this is the topic of sleep. For those of you who don't know Greg, he's a PhD in sleep, circadian rhythm, nutrition, and metabolism that has a PhD from the University of Leeds. He also co-founder of Resilient Nutrition. And before that, and he has, I believe, master degrees in sports performance athletics and sports massage therapy. So Greg has great expertise and knowledge on the topic of sports in all areas, but decided to focus eventually more on the topic of sleep. Great, thank you so much for making the time and sharing that information with us. Is there anything you want to add of what we said about your background and expertise?
No, I don't think so. Thanks very much for the intro, and it's lovely to be here.
Great, thank you so much, Kate. And we believe we can start. And given everything we already said, let's first discuss the most basic thing, which is why do we sleep and why sleep is important for us, basically.
You say it's the most basic thing. I think every sleep scientist on the planet might disagree with that. Because if you're told, I don't think that we fully understand why we sleep, but sleep is clearly very important. If you think about this in evolutionary terms, then it's strange that sleep has survived evolution, given that while we sleep, we can't eat, we can't pass on our genes, and we're vulnerable. So if it's not doing something critical, then we really shouldn't have it. And we know quite a lot about different functions that sleep fills in different parts of the body and with respect to behavior too. So I'll just go into some of those very briefly.
Okay.
So first, if we start with the brain, then when we don't sleep well, we struggle to maintain our attention. We experience intermittent bouts of sleepiness and occasionally even micro sleeps. And if that occurs while, for example, you're driving a car, then that can be fatal. Our working memory is impaired. Our ability to learn new information is also compromised. And sleep strongly affects our mood as well. And it's clear that different forms of poor sleep, and we can touch on what I mean by that later, often precede the development of various different mood disorders, including depression and anxiety. And ultimately, people with certain types of poor sleep are at high risk for suicide as well. With respect to other parts of the body, if we consider adiposity and body composition, then people who report not getting much sleep, which is often defined as less than 6 hours per night, are at higher odds of developing obesity in years to come. And I know later on you plan to touch on sleep and food intake, and that's one of the contributors, but also sleep affects how we metabolize foods, such that after insufficient sleep, our insulin sensitivity, which is a determinant of risk of diseases such as diabetes and Alzheimer's, tends to deteriorate. And then there are the effects on the cardiovascular system. And when somebody gets insufficient sleep, you'll see a rise in certain stress hormones in the body, which might be one of the reasons that people are disposed to certain cardiovascular events. As an example of this, at daylight savings time each year, we lose an hour of sleep, and there's a small but measurable increase in cardiovascular events when that takes place. Then there are the effects of sleep on the immune system, and people who get less sleep around the time of exposure to certain types of virus are more likely to develop more severe symptoms than people who get longer sleep around virus inoculation. And related to that, people who are deprived of sleep around the time that they receive a vaccination for a virus tend to, at least in the short term, develop fewer antibodies to the virus than people who get more sleep. And then there are the effects on certain behaviors too. And people who regularly get little sleep are more likely to smoke, they're more likely to drink alcohol in an irresponsible way. And the list goes on, but the final thing that I'll touch on is sports performance, which we might get to later.
Yeah.
And obviously general health is important to how you recover from exercise. And it's also important to your acute performance. And it's been shown that different forms of sleep restriction and sleep deprivation can contribute to impaired performance in endurance exercise, but also intermittent sprint exercise, strength and power exercise, so things like vertical jumping and performance in the gym, lifting weights. And then there are the effects on motor skills, and fine motor skills and gross motor skills that are important to sports performance, such as serving in tennis, also tend to drop off when people haven't had enough sleep. So really, sleep contributes to all of these different aspects of how we feel and function each day. And a simple way to think about sleep is that it serves to optimize the body for wakefulness each day, which might sound facile, but I think ultimately that's what it comes down to.
Yep. Given all the list and all the things you mentioned, I believe that people now consider sleep on another way. And the way I express myself, it's basic. It's something they should not consider sleep as, and should think about how and what they're doing to improve their sleep. So Greg, that was a great intro and information on sleep. So we can dive a little bit deeper and discuss the types of sleep, since I don't know that people are aware that there are different types of sleep, but can we just provide more details, the types of sleep and what's the difference between them?
Sure. I think what you're referring to here is the stages of sleep.
Exactly, yes.
And there are different ways to break these down. Broadly, they're broken down into so-called non-rapid eye movement sleep, or non-REM sleep, and rapid eye movement sleep, or REM sleep. And as we sleep at night, we cycle through these two distinct stages. And early in the sleep period, so at the start of the bout of sleep, non-REM sleep predominates. But then later in the evening, we spend an increasingly large proportion of our sleep in REM sleep. And there are various thoughts as to why this is the case. We probably don't need to dwell about those, but what I'll do is I'll just explain the distinct types of non-REM sleep, which is typically broken down into 3 discrete stages. The first of these is known as stage 1 sleep, and we don't spend much time in this stage. You can think of it simply as a bridge between being awake and being asleep. And we then transition into stage 2 non-REM sleep. And this is the stage of sleep in which we spend the largest proportion of our time sleeping. It's characterized by a few particular events. So one is a type of brainwave known as a sleep spindle. And these seem to be particularly important to things like memory formation and perhaps sleep consolidation too. So making sure that our sleep isn't disturbed in response to minor environmental disturbances. And I think probably the best characterized way in which this stage of sleep is important is the transfer of information from a short-term, limited capacity information store in the hippocampus in the brain to longer-term storage sites elsewhere in the brain. And memories tend to be distributed in different parts of the brain. They're not all stored in one place, despite what some people seem to think. It's not like you have particular neurons that correspond to particular memories, even if there are relationships between patterns of activity in the brain and recollection of certain memories. So with that said, we then transition to so-called slow wave sleep or deep sleep. And as we move from that stage 1 to stage 2 to slow wave sleep, sleep becomes deeper, by which I mean that it's harder to wake somebody from sleep. Brain waves slow down, respiration, so the speed at which we breathe, slows as well, as does heart rate. And this deeper stage of sleep is again important to memory formation, but it's interestingly particularly important to the restoration of certain tissues in the body. So it's during this stage of sleep in which we secrete large pulses of growth hormone, for instance, which is important to things like the remodeling of connective tissues. And if you're in the gym working out hard, then it's important, of course, to have strong connective tissue in your muscles, but in your tendons and your ligaments and so on too. And it's during this stage of sleep also that we seem to prioritize the formation of memory in the immune system too. So the immune system is subdivided into 2 branches. There is the so-called innate branch, which you're born with, and then there's the adaptive branch. So as we interact in the world, we're exposed to various different pathogens, and we need to respond to those by developing antibodies so that we're protected against the deleterious effects of those pathogens in the future. And it seems to be slow wave sleep that's especially important to this formation of memory in the immune system as well. And we then go from there typically back into a lighter stage of non-REM sleep and then transition into REM sleep. It's known as rapid eye movement sleep because during this stage of sleep, there are characteristic side-to-side eye movements. And it's sometimes known as paradoxical sleep because while most muscles in the body are paralyzed, at least in people who have healthy sleep, which presumably is so that we don't act out our dreams. If you measure activity in the brain, then the brain activity actually looks quite a lot like wakefulness, although some parts of the brain will be as much as 30% more metabolically active than they are during wakefulness. And there are also some quite bizarre events that take place during this stage of sleep. For example, if you're a guy, you'll get erections during this stage of sleep. If you're a girl, you'll experience clitoral swelling, which isn't so obvious, but does take place. And there'll be rapid fluctuations in things like your heart rate and your blood pressure at this time too, as well as your breathing rate. And with respect to what's going on in the brain, while once more, this stage of sleep does seem to be important to memory formation, although I'll add that different stages of sleep are probably involved in slightly different types of memory formation and also the integration of new information with existing memories. During rapid eye movement sleep, we can think of this stage as being important to trying to take recently acquired information and then take information from past memories and use it to explore associations between those 2 different sources of information so that we better understand the world. It's almost a bit like being in a safe space in which to explore previously unexplored information to make better sense of the world, if that makes any sense. And if people are interested, a very good book was recently published on this. It's very accessible, written by Robert Stickgold and Antonio Zadra, and the name of it is When Brains Dream. It's definitely worth reading. So those are the different stages of sleep, and we could go on and explore those in more depth, but that's probably what most people need to know. But with that said, there are, of course, implications of those different stages. And as an example of this, if you're somebody who wakes 2 hours earlier than you would like to wake up in the morning because you have to get up for work, you're going to specifically end up losing a relatively large proportion of your REM sleep because we get most of that type of sleep late in the sleep episode. If, however, you end up staying up much later than you intended, you're going to tend to retain a substantial amount of your REM sleep, but probably end up losing relatively more slow wave sleep. And so in this way, the different times of night at which we lose sleep influence how sleep affects us. And based on that, if somebody has to wake up earlier than they would like, they're likely to lose the creativity boosting and mood boosting benefits of rapid eye movement sleep. And if somebody has to stay up later than they would like, they're probably going to lose some of the more physically restorative aspects of the deeper stage of sleep.
Okay. And that's very important and great for summarizing that with an example that I believe will be very beneficial for our followers to distinguish how the different stages of the sleep function, and if they want to improve their sleep, where to focus and what changes they can do around their schedule to make sure that they're getting the benefits of different stages. And hopefully they can do that, since we all do know that different people have different responsibilities and schedules. But again, I think that most people can sacrifice some social media time or Netflix later in the night for better sleep. So thanks for that example, Greg.
Pleasure.
Okay, so we said that one finished the fact that the people sacrifice part of their sleep, and the main purpose of the podcast was to discuss and for our followers to get a more insight information about how the quality of sleep and basically how sleep deprivation affects our performance in the gym, and why this is important. So I wanted to touch base on this, and for you to provide more information how that deprivation really can put us in a bad situation when it comes to training and to stall our progress.
Cool, sounds good. So what I'll do is I'll start by just mentioning the fact that there are different aspects of sleep that are important. And much of the time we focus on sleep deprivation or sleep restriction. And just to clarify what I mean by those two terms, sleep deprivation is the complete absence of sleep. So you keep somebody awake the whole night. Sleep restriction is when somebody has the opportunity to get some sleep, but they don't get as much sleep as they need. And sleep duration is certainly important, but there are other dimensions of sleep that are key too. You mentioned one, which is sleep quality.
Okay.
And there are different components of sleep quality. One, for example, is how long it takes you to fall asleep. One is your overall sleep efficiency, so the proportion of time that you're in bed that you're actually asleep. One is how well you feel you sleep, so your subjective experience of your sleep. And then there are some other things too, including the actual patterns of electrical activity in your brain, which people needn't worry about, I don't think, because right now assessing and modifying those isn't practical.
Okay.
And then there are certain clinical conditions too that influence sleep quality. So for example, some people will experience temporary collapsing of the upper airway during sleep, or so-called sleep apnea.
Okay.
And that has various different negative consequences, both on how people function, but also on different aspects of the health, in particular inflammation and cardiovascular health. So sleep quality is another of these. Then there is the timing of sleep. And I mentioned earlier how sleeping at suboptimal times relative to somebody's preferred sleep times can influence sleep quality. And that shows that these different dimensions of sleep interact with each other. And I think if anybody who is listening to this is a shift worker, then they'll be able to empathize with the fact that if they try and sleep at a time when their body's clock is promoting wakefulness, their sleep quality is going to be much lower than if they're sleeping at their preferred time. And then finally, there's the variability of all these different measures too. And I mentioned those unique dimensions of sleep health because all of them independently predict risk of various different chronic diseases and ultimately mortality too. So when we're thinking about improving sleep, it's important to consider all of those. Okay. And when we're discussing the effects of sleep on performance or adaptations to exercise, again, we just need to bear in mind exactly what we're speaking about when talking about sleep disruption.
Okay.
So moving now to the second part of your question, which was about the effects of insufficient sleep on performance and how we respond to exercise in particular. I glossed over this earlier, but what I'll do is I'll just zoom in on the effects on strength exercise, because I'm assuming that most people are probably most interested in getting bigger and stronger. And while this hasn't been that well studied, truth be told, what seems to be the case is that if people regularly don't get enough sleep, their performance in multi-joint exercises done for multiple repetitions is compromised. So if you were doing, say, 3 sets of 10 reps in the leg press or the bench press, then you'd probably do fewer total reps after, say, 5 hours in bed than you would after, say, 8 hours in bed.
Okay.
And that, of course, is just the acute effect on performance. If you look at maximal strength, then the research done so far doesn't tend to show such a clear effect, but I think it's important to understand that much of this work has just looked at, for example, squeezing a hand grip dynamometer as hard as possible. And that is a very isolated type of force production. It's not doing a 5-rep max in a front squat. And I think if the measures were sensitive enough, then you definitely see an effect on more externally valid or real world type strength performance. And then there are, of course, the effects on different bodily systems that influence how we respond to exercise. And just to mention some of the examples that are relevant here, one is that there is some evidence that some men specifically will experience a reduction in their testosterone levels when they regularly don't get enough sleep. Again, the data aren't entirely clear, but I think there clearly is an effect. And obviously, your levels of those male sex hormones influence things like your ability to accrue muscle mass over time. Then there are the effects, of course, on the immune system that I touched on earlier. If you're fighting an infection, then you won't be able to train as hard as frequently. There are effects on some determinants of how you adapt to exercise, such as muscle protein synthesis.
Okay.
And again, this hasn't been that well studied, but it seems that if you deprive someone of sleep or if you restrict their sleep, then in the short term, the synthesis of new proteins in skeletal muscle, which is the main determinant of whether you're gaining muscle or losing muscle over time, it's much more variable than muscle protein breakdown is, seems to be lower than when you're getting enough sleep. And you probably can compensate for that in part by exercise, but I'm guessing that net protein balance, so how much muscle you're gaining or losing respectively, is going to be lower if you're not getting enough sleep. And related to this, while gains in muscle mass during overfeeding, a period in which somebody's consuming more calories than they need to maintain energy balance, hasn't really been studied with respect to the effects of sleep on the composition of the weight gain. It does seem that if you take somebody, you put them on a weight loss diet, and one group of people get enough time in bed each night, and another group gets insufficient time in bed each night, the group that doesn't get enough sleep because of the insufficient time in bed ends up losing less fat mass and substantially more muscle mass than when they do get enough sleep. So if you think about somebody who's trying to get ready for beach season or for a photo shoot or for the stage, then it's really important to give yourself enough time in bed at this time if you want to lose as much fat as possible while holding on to as much fat-free mass as possible. So there are all of those different elements of the effects of sleep loss to consider. And one thing I want to add is that if you then take somebody who regularly doesn't get enough sleep and you give them more time in bed, and hence they end up sleeping more, good things happen. And pretty much everything, everything negative that I've spoken about so far can be substantially reversed by getting more sleep if you are regularly short on sleep. And so if we look at exercise performance, then I won't go into too much detail here, but the research so far has shown that if you take athletes who normally don't get enough time in bed and you give them more time in bed, then their performance in strength and power exercise improves. Things like multi-directional sprinting activities, vertical jump performance, and also some other relevant outcomes such as reaction time. It's very important in the context of things like sprint sports and team sports too. All of those things improve. And coordination improves too. So things like serving accuracy will go up, or how accurately somebody can throw a dart. People also, of course, feel better. And then beyond the effects on performance and how people feel, health is meaningfully improved too. But just to mention one study, which is probably the most relevant to this particular audience, there was some work published not long ago showing that if you take people who haven't done much training before, you put them through a structured strength training program, and one group of people undergoing this just sleep as they normally do, but the other group are given some education about how to sleep better,
Okay.
then it seems that the group that gets the sleep education end up losing a substantial amount of fat, while the group that doesn't get any sleep education gain a small amount of fat, but not a significant amount. The effects on muscle mass in that study weren't clear, but I'll mention that numerically, the group that got the sleep education did gain more muscle mass than the group that didn't. And because of that, I think it's probably worth touching on some things that people can do to sleep better if they want to maximize their performance in the gym and also improve how they look and how they feel each day.
Yeah, for sure. We will touch base on that, because I also just wanted to really quickly add on what you already said about the example of the study with the fat loss diet, where the two groups were with different quality of sleep, and one lost more fat and maintained more muscle mass, and vice versa. So about our eating behavior, what other effects as a sleep restriction, deprivation, about how we feel during the day, how we tolerate, let's say, carbohydrates specifically, and metabolizing those and different macronutrients. Do you have information in regard to that specifically?
Of course. So a couple of years ago, Siriman Rutrikal and her colleagues did an analysis in which they looked at all of the different studies that had been done to date, in which people come into a lab and they either have enough sleep or they undergo sleep deprivation or some form of sleep restriction. And then subsequently, the scientists look at things like energy intake and food choices, but also relevant metabolic outcomes too. And what they found was that, unsurprisingly, when people are restricted or deprived of sleep, they feel hungrier. They also consume more calories, on average about 250 calories more each day. Doesn't sound like that much, but multiply that by 365 days in the year, and that's roughly the amount of energy in 12 kilos of fat tissue.
And that will add up for sure.
Yeah, so it could be meaningful over time.
Yeah.
And one of the interesting things is that the studies also show that the electrical activity of parts of the brain that are involved in decisions about which foods to eat changes, such that foods become more rewarding to people. And that might explain why it's not just that people eat more after insufficient sleep. They also gravitate to more energy-dense, rewarding foods. And given our modern food environments, that often means consuming more processed food.
Yeah.
And if you're consuming more food and more processed food as well, bad things are bound to happen. So it's no great surprise that related to this, they found that insulin sensitivity declined.
Okay.
And so not only are these people consuming more food, their ability to effectively dispose of the carbohydrates in the food declines as well. And then there are probably some other consequences that are relevant here, but they're not quite so well characterized. But I mentioned earlier the effects on things like skeletal muscle protein turnover, which are very relevant to your audience. And there are probably various other nuances that we could get into too, related to things like inflammation and so on. But I think that the overall picture looks like one in which people are disposed to eating more food, metabolizing that food less effectively, gaining weight over time, and becoming less insulin sensitivity, which ultimately is going to manifest as worse health. And that's not just going to predispose them to diseases such as diabetes, but also a host of other issues too, including things like deterioration in brain function.
Great. Okay, thank you for that summary, Greg. I believe that given how you present the information, people should consider if they and how they choose foods based on their sleep and quality and quantity. So what he discussed until now, I think that now everyone will be waiting for that part of the podcast where we'll be providing some practical information about different tips and advices how to improve the quality of sleep. And believe it will be great for everyone to benefit from. So would you mind sharing some like general advices and things you find with people that are easy to implement in the daily life so they can start improving their sleep?
Sure. And there are lots of these. So I don't want this to seem overwhelming. I'll therefore preface my answer by saying that if there's something that I say that sounds like it's doable and it sounds like it's likely to be helpful in your particular context, then just start with that one thing. But I'll mention various things because the sources of our sleep problems differ between each of us. And there is a huge range of so-called sleep phenotypes that people have. And obviously we can only scratch the surface here. But with that said, we can think about breaking down these different sleep improvement tips into two buckets. So one is sleep hygiene, which is the list of behaviors that many people will be all too familiar with. And that includes things like not consuming too much caffeine too late in the day, not consuming too much alcohol too late in the day, and so on. And then there are some other things that people should consider doing too. And I'll actually start with the latter category. Just because I think that they're more interesting, and we can also tailor these to the particular difficulties that people are currently facing in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think one of these is stress related. And obviously a lot of people are experiencing various forms of stress right now, including things like financial stress. Maybe they've lost a loved one. Maybe they are isolated or isolating, all of which can, of course, be quite crippling in different ways. And there are things that we can do about these issues. One category of things is so-called, one category of things relates to things that we can actively do that will help us better cope with these stresses, but not directly affect the source of stress themselves. So if something's out of your control, then this category tends to be particularly helpful. And these types of behaviors include things like exercising, of course. Mindfulness-based meditation is very helpful for sleep, especially in the context of pain, interestingly. And if you consider implementing mindfulness, then I'd probably recommend beginning by doing it at the start of your day, because we tend to have more control over our schedules early in the day than late in the day. And start with brief bouts of mindfulness. A lot of people try to do too much too soon. And even just starting with a minute a day can be enough to make it a regular habit, and then quite soon you'll be doing substantially more than that and be realizing more of the benefits of it too. So there are those types of activities, but then there are things that you can do to try and more actively solve the problems that you face. And one of my favorites of these, and one that I think is particularly effective right now, is scheduling worry time in your waking day, which sounds almost comical to some people when they first hear it. But the idea here is that if you're busy during the daytime, then often that busyness, whether it's at work or trying to put out any fires that are going on, is enough to suppress ruminations and anxieties. And then later in the day, once work is out of the way, those frustrations can bubble up to the surface right around the time that you're planning to wind down and get to sleep. So by scheduling 15 minutes, probably around dinner time, maybe just after dinner, in which you sit down with a piece of paper and a pen and you list whatever you're worried about in one column. And then in the adjacent column, you list the smallest next thing that you can do to address that concern, can be really helpful. And once you've done that, you then commit to not worrying until your 15 minutes of worry time the following day. Another thing that you can do at this time is to make a to-do list. And these two different strategies are of course related to each other. So you could just tack this on, but making a to-do list for the next day in which you list everything that you need to get done in as much detail as is necessary. And ideally you block out times for those different activities. Can both be good for productivity, but it can also avoid you going to bed thinking about everything you need to get done the next day, because you're effectively getting those thoughts out of your head and onto paper. And you can then keep the piece of paper and the pen by your bedside in case you wake up thinking about whatever you need to get done. And then people have some control over when they're exposed to certain types of stresses. If you find reading the news stressful or watching the news stressful, then it might make sense to do that relatively early in your waking day or in the middle of your waking day, as opposed to doing that within a couple of hours of bedtime. Yeah. So I think those are some fundamental strategies that people use to help better cope with stress. Another issue that people face at the moment is having to work in places within their homes that could interfere with sleep. Yeah. And many people I know end up occasionally lying on their beds and holding their laptop on them and tapping out emails. And the problem with that is that over time you learn to associate your bed with somewhere that you're thinking about work. And of course, that's the last thing that you want to happen. Yeah. So it's important to save your bed for sex and sleep only. And this is especially true if you're currently struggling with your sleep. If your sleep's fine, then I would save it for those two things. But then also I think reading in bed is fine. If you have a bedside lamp and you have that on and you have a book by your bed that you read in the 30 minutes or so before you go to sleep, if your sleep's relatively good for the most part, then that's absolutely fine. But be cognizant of that. And related to this tip, I think if you have to work in your bedroom, then designate a space for that work and keep that space for work and work only. It's ironic that I'm saying this because right now I'm in quarantine and I am recording this from my bedroom, which is not normally the case, but I'm just keenly aware of the effects that this can have. So there's that too. And then also related to this, it's important to only go to bed when you're actually sleepy. Okay. And if you lie in bed and you don't fall asleep within 15 minutes or so, get out of bed and do something relaxing in dim lighting. And then only return to bed when you are sleepy again. You don't want to lie in bed awake during the night, because that way you'll associate your bed with somewhere that you're awake and thinking about things. And of course, we want to strengthen the association between the bed and sleep. And then moving on to some other strategies, I'll just touch on the importance of the pre-bed wind down period. I think putting aside 1 to 2 hours at the end of the day in which to wind down is really important. And an analogy that's often used by people in the world of sleep research is driving a car. If you've been busy during the day, it's as if you're driving a car and your foot's on the accelerator. And at the end of the day, you want to park that car into the garage of sleep. And if you're driving too quickly, then you're going to struggle to park your car. If, however, you've got plenty of time in which to slow down, you're more likely to park your car successfully. So giving yourself enough time in which to wind down, ideally 1 to 2 hours, and then doing activities at this time that you find relaxing. And ideal activities include having a hot shower or a hot bath 1 to 2 hours before bed for about 10 minutes. And people often ask me, what does hot mean? A shower at about 40 degrees Celsius is probably about right. Anything that's going to raise the temperature of your skin, ideally by a couple of degrees. The reason being that if you do that, then you'll actually lose heat faster from your core. And that drop in core temperature is important to sleep initiation and sleep maintenance. So 10-minute hot shower, 10-minute hot bath, about an hour before bed. And then after that, pick something that you personally find relaxing. For a lot of people, this might mean reading a book. It could mean watching TV. The issue with screen time, though, is that people often find the content very stimulating. If you're watching a scary film, say, or they lose track of time if your Netflix is on autoplay. And there's the effect of the exposure to light from these devices, which itself has some alerting effects and can also delay the timing of your body's clock and thereby delay your sleep. I think the actual importance of that is a little bit overstated at times if you spent enough time outdoors during the day. And for that reason, I always recommend that people spend plenty of time outdoors during daylight being physically active. It's not clear what the minimum amount of time to spend outdoors to reap the benefits of that is, and it probably depends on the particular outcome that you're interested in, because being outdoors in daylight is of course not just important to anchoring the timing of your body's clock each day, it's also important to things like your mood, hence the fact that people experience seasonal affective disorder. It might be important to some aspects of cardiometabolic health, such as blood pressure. And it's probably also important to things like learning as well. So spend at least an hour outdoors each day if you can. And if you can't, because you're in quarantine, then spend your time by the window. It sounds silly, but there's been research looking at office workers who work close to windows versus their colleagues who work far from windows. And the people who work closest to the window sleep better because they're getting more high intensity light that contains lots of short wavelengths, which to us would typically appear as blue or green, but full spectrum white light also has a lot of this type of light in it. So spending time outdoors is really important, and being physically active will give you a double whammy of benefits too. And then the other thing that I'll mention is the importance of using your smartphone in a mindful way. It's very clear that people are spending more time in front of screens than before the pandemic. And I mentioned earlier some of the reasons why this can be problematic. There's the content, there's the intensity of the light, there's the spectrum of the light, and there's also the loss of sense of time. If you're scrolling through your social media feed and your Instagram feed is bottomless, then it's very easy for half an hour to go by. And you look up at the end of it and think, what just happened? You just got lost. And if that sounds familiar to you, then ensuring that you turn off your smartphone at least half an hour before bed and keep your smartphone out of your bedroom is really important. And there's been some interesting research on young people recently showing that when people use the simple strategy, they fall asleep faster, they get more total sleep. The quality of their sleep improves as indexed by the efficiency of their sleep. And then as a result of these changes to their sleep, their performance the next day improves too. And they specifically looked at working memory, so the ability to store information in the brain temporarily. And so that simple strategy, I think, can be really transformative, especially for people who have adolescents, because I think that there are certain age categories, demographic categories, who are more likely to find this problematic. It's probably especially true of young people. I'm not saying that using your smartphone is inherently bad, because that, of course, is not the case. I liken phone usage to diet. There are healthy ways of using your phone in the same way that there are foods that are healthy. Yeah. And then there are junk ways of using your phone in the same way that it's not smart to consume every meal from McDonald's. So I think those are probably some of the core strategies that people should consider using. But I'm happy to touch on any of the sleep hygiene stuff too, if you feel that would be helpful.
I think that you have covered a lot of important stuff that as a beginning, everyone from our followers can start implementing and use in order to improve their sleep hygiene, their sleep quality and quantity. If you find something more important and can be considered with a priority, of course, I trust your expertise and judgment to touch base a little bit deeper on that, but I find everything you explained already is sufficient. But if you'd like, you can add something else. I truly trust your judgment on that.
Okay. I'll mention a couple of things.
Okay.
One is because some people listening to this might be very big individuals. Maybe they have lots of muscle mass, or maybe they're trying to gain lots of muscle mass and therefore gaining quite a lot of fat mass too. Or maybe they're listening to this because they want to look better, but right now they have quite a lot of fat to lose. If any of those are true of you, then there's a chance that you might have sleep apnea. And there are different forms of sleep apnea. Obstructive sleep apnea is the most common form, and it's more common in overweight people, which is why I mentioned those groups of people earlier. When I say overweight, I'm talking about overweight in relation to BMI. If you look at, say, Arnold Schwarzenegger when he was winning Mr. Olympia, he was technically obese, but obviously he was not obese.
Yeah.
So I'm using it in that way as opposed to necessarily talking about fat mass per se. But anyway, people who are overweight or obese are more likely to have sleep apnea. And if you're somebody who shares your bed with someone and your bed partner has seen you temporarily stop breathing during the night, then that's a telltale sign that you might have it. And there are various other symptoms that you might experience. One of the more prominent ones is strong daytime sleepiness. But if any of that resonates in some way, go to the website stopbang, stopbang.ca, and there's a questionnaire that you'll find that you can go through that will help you get a sense of the likelihood that you have sleep apnea.
Okay.
And I'm mentioning it because it's very burdensome, both in terms of its effects on health, but also its effects on safety. And it's also increasingly widespread because on average, people are getting heavier and heavier worldwide. And it's massively underdiagnosed. So I think that would be one important one. And then the final one that I'll mention is things that you can do if you're struggling to sleep because you have a very busy mind or an uncomfortable body. And the things I've mentioned so far are helpful, but there are some specific interventions that you can try. One is if you're somebody who tries to force your sleep, you go to bed and you closely monitor your sleep and you are asking yourself, am I asleep yet? Fall asleep. Why can't I sleep? Then try something known as paradoxical intention. The idea here is what you resist persists. And the approach that you would take is to stay relaxed. So keep breathing through your tummy. And as you do so, gently hold your eyes open while you're lying in bed. And as time passes, congratulate yourself for staying awake, but relaxed. And so now, by focusing on staying awake and relaxed, you're no longer trying to force your sleep. And you'll actually end up falling asleep faster than you otherwise would. I mentioned breathing there. I think if you wake up, or if you're awake in bed and you're just feeling generally quite stressed, diaphragmatic breathing is really helpful. Really simple. All you do is breathe through your nose, breathe slowly. Don't try and control your breath excessively, but just focus on the sensation of your tummy rising and falling as you breathe through your nose. When people do that, they tend to change activity in the autonomic or automatic branch of the nervous system in a way that is conducive to healthy sleep. Another strategy is known as progressive muscle relaxation, something that a lot of athletes will use if they're feeling worked up ahead of a competition during wakefulness, just to help them become more relaxed. But if you're in bed and you feel a lot of bodily tension, then this strategy can definitely help you fall asleep faster. And what you'll do is you'll just sequentially scan through different parts of your body, holding the contraction of certain muscles and then relaxing them. You might start with your toes. You'd start by contracting your toes, so tensing those muscles, not too hard, holding that tension for maybe 6 seconds or so. And then as you relax, you exhale. You move on from your toes to elsewhere in your foot, scan upwards through your body. So you start with your feet, but you'll move on to your lower legs and then your thighs and then your hips and so on until you're up at the top of your head. And when people do that, once again, they tend to fall asleep faster. And then finally, if your thoughts are just stuck in a loop, for some reason you have something on your mind that you can't get out of your mind, maybe you're replaying a conversation that you had earlier in the day that you wish you'd had differently. If that's the case, then I think using visualization can be really handy. And all you do is maybe begin by practicing this during the daytime, but picture a scene that you find very relaxing. Maybe there's a place to you that's special. Maybe it's a forest near your home, for example. You know the route well where you go walking, and you just walk through that route on a sunny, pleasant day. Maybe it's warm. And as you do that, you try and picture the scene in as much vivid detail as possible. What can you see? What can you hear? What can you smell? What can you feel on your skin? Who are you with? And so on. And you can train yourself to make that experience quite captivating and also to make it deeply relaxing. And then during those times when you're feeling a bit worked up or something's just replaying in your mind, you can go to that happy place and hopefully thereby wind down and fall asleep faster.
Great. Well, some of the tips that you just shared are definitely something I will consider using, by the way, since those are new for myself. I'm really like a sleep quality fanatic, and I'm using different things to improve my sleep and testing different stuff. But that muscle activation and then relaxation tip, I will definitely try to use it. And since I shared in the beginning of our conversation, now with the newborn, we both, myself and my wife, will benefit from getting better sleep now, since the young man is kind of active 2 times during the night, and we'll definitely get.
How are you handling that at the moment? Are you shifting between the two of you, giving yourself a bit more time in bed?
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah. So okay, Greg, this what you have shared and all that information, it's amazing. And again, I wanted to thank you for your time, and that you shared all those tips and described how sleep affects our life in general, from general health. Then we went through training, eating behavior, and information how to improve our sleep. Everyone, I will link Greg's information in the description of this video, so you can go check his Instagram account, his website, and the content he's putting out. So if you want to dig deeper in the quality of sleep, Greg is sharing information on a daily basis, so you can benefit from directly from the source. And again, you can work in order to improve your sleep, which, as you see, will definitely improve the quality of life in general, not only from training and eating perspective, but mood, behavior, and overall productivity. So again, thank you, Greg, for taking the time. It was a pleasure for us for being on the podcast.
Pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Greg.